That morning, Laura thought she was imagining it. A soft scrape at the door, faint as wind brushing old timber. But when she stepped onto the porch, she froze. A wild bobcat stood there, exhausted but unwavering, its amber eyes fixed on her. It didn't growl or flee. Instead, it gently nudged a trembling little creature toward her boots. And in that breathless moment, Laura understood. This wasn't chance. It was a mother's final plea from the heart of the winter woods. The sound woke her before the alarm did. A faint, deliberate scrape against wood, too steady to be a loose shutter and too soft to be a branch in the wind. Laura Brennan lay still in the half-light, listening. The cabin breathed around her, the ticking of cooling pipes, the low hum of the fridge. Then came that sound again, right at the front door. She glanced at the digital clock on the nightstand. 5:06 a.m. In Idaho's sawtooth country, that usually meant nothing more sinister than a curious raccoon or a snow-laden limb settling. But something in that rhythm, scratch, pause, scratch, made her ex-paramedic instincts tighten, the way they used to when a dispatch call sounded wrong before she even heard the details. Snowlight seeped through the thin curtain, turning the small bedroom a washed-out gray. The cabin felt colder than it should, as if the night hadn't quite left yet. Laura swung her feet to the floor, wincing at the sting of cold pine boards under her toes. The sound came again, this time followed by a low, muffled thump that did not belong to raccoons or wind. For a heartbeat, she considered ignoring it. Out here, 12 miles from town and a mile from the nearest neighbor? Pretend you didn't hear it was sometimes the safest option. But the job she'd walked away from still lived inside her muscles. People had called 911 for less than that sound. Her hands were already reaching for yesterday's jeans draped over the chair. She moved through the narrow hallway without turning on the lights, trusting the layout she now knew better than her own reflection. Wall, coat rack, tiny framed map of the forest, then the short run to the front door. The cabin's old timbers creaked under her weight, answering the soft, insistent scratching from the other side with their own tired groan. At the door, she paused. The deadbolt felt cold under her fingers. Laura pressed one eye to the narrow window beside the frame, expecting to see nothing but her own pale reflection. Instead, the porch came into view. Snow-dusted boards, a sagging boot mat, and right at the threshold, a shape that did not fit any normal morning. It was a cat, but not the kind anyone kept in their lap. A bobcat stood squarely on the top step, paws planted, body taut as a drawn bow. Frost clung to the edges of her ears and whiskers. Her coat, mottled gold and gray, was darker along the spine, where wet fur clumped from the cold. Amber eyes burned up at the window, unblinking, not wild with panic, just locked on the shadow of the human inside. Laura's breath caught. She'd seen this bobcat before, at the tree line behind the cabin, a fleeting ghost between junipers. Always at a distance, always vanishing the second she shifted on the porch. Never this close, never on the wood planks of her home like she belonged there. The cat lifted one front paw, set it down again with a soft tap against the door. Only then did Laura see the bundle on the porch between them. A small, crumpled shape, half buried in powdery snow, the color muddy against the pale boards. For an instant, her mind refused to assign it meaning. Just a dark smear, a fallen glove, a chunk of bark carried by the wind. Then a tiny shudder ran through it, and something like a whimper slipped into the cold air. Her body reacted before her thoughts did. Heart rate up, breathing shallow but controlled, the way she'd trained herself through 1,000 emergency calls. Years of trauma and sirens and fluorescent hospital corridors crashed against the silence of this mountain morning. She reached for the porch light, flicked it on, and the bulb spilled harsh yellow over fur, ice, and red. She wished were only melted snow. The bobcat didn't flinch at the sudden light. She only shifted her weight, muscles rolling under her hide, and backed up exactly one step, as if to give Laura room. Her gaze never left the woman's face behind the glass. It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't the look of a predator defending a kill. It was closer to something Laura recognized from human eyes she'd seen in the back of ambulances. A raw, exhausted plea. For a moment, everything in Laura screamed no. No to opening a door with a wild animal on the other side. No to inviting claws and teeth into a space that had finally started to feel safe. No to stepping again into a situation where the outcome would hinge on her choices. Out here, she'd promised herself she was done being the person everyone counted on when things went bad. But the small shape on the porch twitched again, a weak, broken motion that cut clean through all her careful distance. Somewhere in the trees beyond the cabin, a coyote called once and then went quiet. Laura swallowed, thumb resting on the deadbolt, pulse thudding in her ears. On one side of the wood, warmth, safety, and the quieter life she'd come here to build. On the other, a wounded scrap of life and a wild mother who had come, impossibly, to her door. Months before a bobcat ever stood on her porch, Laura Brennan had walked out of a very different door. It was the back entrance of St. Mark's Hospital in Boise, the one paramedics used at the end of a shift when they were too tired to face the main lobby. She'd stepped into the parking lot still wearing her radio harness, then unclicked it and set it gently in the nearest trash can, like she was lowering a body. The last call had been a rollover on black ice. Minivan. Family. The kind of thing they all tried. Not to think about when the roads went bad. Laura had done her job by the book. Airway, breathing, compressions. But the little boy's chest had stayed stubbornly still under her hands. In the fluorescent wash of the trauma bay, the attending had called time, and for the first time in 15 years, Laura hadn't been able to make herself move to the next task. After that night, sleep became something that happened to other people. Every siren in town sounded like an accusation. She lasted 3 more weeks, long enough to train her replacement and turn in her badge. When she told her captain she was done, he'd stared at her like she was speaking a foreign language. "You're one of the good ones, Bren. You don't just walk away." She had, though. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking otherwise. The cabin in Idaho had started as a listing on a website she'd clicked just to see what life looked like where no one knew her name. 2 bedrooms, wood stove, no immediate neighbors, cell service, intermittent at best. To anyone else, it might have sounded like a warning. To Laura, sitting at her kitchen table under the harsh buzz of city lights, it sounded like a promise. Quiet, trees, things that bled and healed without her. She sold what she didn't need, boxed what she couldn't let go of, and drove north with everything else in the back of a dusty Subaru. The first time she turned off the paved highway onto the rutted forest road, she felt the tension in her shoulders drop half an inch, as if the weight of the city slid off at the edge of the asphalt. Pines closed in on either side, thick and dark and indifferent to human emergencies. The cabin turned out to be smaller than the photos, but sturdier than she'd feared. Someone had loved it once. There were old nails in the doorframe where family pictures must have hung, and a row of coffee mugs still hanging on hooks by the sink. She updated the essentials, installed new smoke detectors with muscle memory, then walked the property line with a folded map in her pocket, letting the silence soak in. Through a former coworker, she'd been put in touch with a regional wildlife rescue group that needed field techs and transport drivers. It wasn't the same as running code in an ambulance, but there was a similar thread. Things in trouble, a clock ticking, her hands in the middle trying to make a difference. Her first assignment was a red-tailed hawk with a busted wing. It had screamed and snapped at her every moment of the drive, and the defiance had felt strangely comforting. The days settled into a rhythm. Mornings with coffee on the porch, breath ghosting in the cool air while the sun crawled down the mountainsides. Afternoons checking game cameras, hauling supplies. Sometimes answering a call about a deer tangled in fencing or a duck with fishing line around its leg. Nights by the fire, with a book she rarely finished more than 3 pages of before sleep finally found her. It was during one of those quiet mornings in early fall that she first saw the bobcat. She'd been halfway through her second cup when movement at the edge of the clearing snagged her attention. Not the shifting of a branch or the quick dart of a squirrel, but something heavier, sliding between brush with the unhurried certainty of an animal that knew it belonged there. The cat stepped out from behind a cluster of sage and stopped. Tawny coat mottled with faint spots, short tail tipping once, then going still. She wasn't large, not like the mountain lions people told stories about over coffee at the diner, but every line of her body spoke of muscle and caution. Laura froze in her rocking chair, fingers tightening around the warm mug. She had seen plenty of bobcats in photos, a few in passing from a rescue truck. She had never had one study her porch like this. They watched each other in a fragile standstill. The distance between them wasn't far, maybe 30 yards, but it felt like a canyon cut by years of separate lives. Laura resisted the urge to reach for her phone or camera. Instead, she let her eyes do the work, memorizing the triangular ears, the white patch under the chin, the way the cat's ribs showed a little too clearly beneath the fur. Then, as silently as she'd arrived, the bobcat turned and melted back into the trees. Over the next week, the cat appeared twice more at dawn, always at the same spot, always pausing just long enough to check the open space around the cabin before vanishing. On the 4th morning, after a night when dreams of sirens had chased her awake more than once, Laura noticed something different in the crust of damp earth near the tree line. Prints, small and faint, traveling alongside the larger paw marks. A second set of tracks, lighter, clumsier, the kind a youngster might make. She knelt there for a long time, fingers hovering over the impressions without touching. A mother then. Somewhere out there in the thick underbrush, a set of smaller eyes depended on that lean, wary cat making it through the winter. The knowledge tugged at something deep in her chest, something that remembered cradling the back of a child's head in a moving ambulance and promising help that had come too late. Out here, though, there was still a chance to give a different answer. The first snow of the season arrived like a rumor more than a storm, dusting the pines and softening the sharp lines of the clearing around Laura's cabin. She drove into town that morning in four-wheel drive, wipers sweeping lazy arcs, the world reduced to gray sky and white road. Stanley wasn't much more than a gas station, a diner, and a handful of shops, but it felt like a different planet from the ridge where she lived. The diner sat across from the tiny sheriff's substation, both buildings hunched against the cold, like old men in heavy coats. Inside, the air was thick with coffee and bacon grease, country music humming low from a radio that had probably been there since the 80s. Laura slid into a corner booth, the one that let her see both the front door and the window, a habit that hadn't left her since ambulance days. She'd just wrapped her hands around a chipped mug when the bell over the door jangled and a tall man in a tan deputy's jacket stepped in, stomping snow off his boots. He pulled off his hat, revealing dark hair starting to gray at the temples, and nodded to the handful of regulars as if checking off a mental head count. When his gaze reached her, it paused, curious but not unfriendly. "New face," he said as he approached, voice easy. "You must be the one renting Miller's old cabin up on Ridge Road." She smiled despite herself. In a town this size, privacy was more of a theory than a fact. "Laura," she offered. "Brennan." He introduced himself as Deputy Mark Hensley, sliding into the seat across from her only after she gestured it was okay. They talked the way strangers in small towns do, weather first, then roads, then what brought you here, assuming you weren't born within 5 miles. She kept her answer simple, needed quieter work, took a field position with the Wildlife Rescue Group, liked trees more than traffic. Mark listened, elbows on the table, turning his coffee mug between his hands like he was weighing her words. "Quiet's good," he said finally. "Just remember it can get too quiet out there in winter. We've had more wolf activity this year. Elk herds are smaller, they're ranging wider. Predators follow." He said it matter-of-factly, but there was a warning under the surface. Not a threat, just the reality of living where things with teeth still made the rules when the sun went down. At the next booth, an older man in a feed store jacket leaned back, joining the conversation without invitation. "You ask me. We've got more than wolves to worry about," he grumbled. "Lost 2 goats last month. Track said Bobcat, big female. I see her near my fence line again. I'm not calling fish and game. I'm dealing with it myself." His name, the waitress mouthed to Laura, was Hank. Laura felt a pinch in her chest. A big female bobcat. It might have been coincidence. There were others in these mountains. But the image of the lean cat at her tree line flashed across her mind anyway. She stirred cream into her coffee, buying herself a second before she answered. "Predators usually go for easy food," she said. "Fence lines are like buffets if they're not secure." Hank snorted. "You one of those folks who think everything wild's a misunderstood house pet?" he asked. "My granddad shot cats like that on sight, kept his stock safe that way." Before Laura could respond, Mark cut in gently. "We're not in your granddad's time anymore, Hank. Game laws are a thing, so are trail cameras." There was a quiet steel in his tone that made the older man turn back to his plate. On the drive back up the mountain, Laura watched the white world slide past and thought about goats, wolves, and a bobcat, who might not know the invisible lines men drew around their property. Back at the cabin, she walked to the edge of the clearing, boots sinking into the thin snow. The bobcat had been there sometime during the night. Her prints ghosted along the tree line, circling wide, never coming too close to the house. Later that week, after a long day, transporting an injured mule deer to the rehab center 2 counties over, Laura opened her fridge and stared at the pack of chicken thighs she'd meant to cook for herself. Instead, she found herself cutting small strips, wrapping them in wax paper. Outside, in the blue hour between daylight and full dark, she carried the bundle to a spot halfway between the cabin and trees and laid it gently on a flat rock. She didn't call, didn't whistle or clap or try to coax. She just stood for a moment, breath curling in front of her, then turned and walked back to the porch, the boards creaking under her boots. Inside, she switched off the interior lights and waited by the window, watching as the clearing slowly folded into night. It was almost full dark when a familiar shape slid from the shadows, moving low and cautious. The bobcat approached the offering like it might explode. She sniffed, muscles tense to bolt, then snatched a strip of meat and sprang back, chewing in quick, efficient bites. Only after several minutes did she return for more, the line of her spine still tight, but no longer trembling. In the dim, Laura saw the hint of ribs under fur and the way the cat's ears flicked at every distant sound. "Just enough to help," she murmured to the glass, feeling the old familiar weight of responsibility settle, uninvited, on her shoulders again. Snow began falling before dawn, soft at first, then thicker, flakes drifting sideways on a wind sharp enough to sting bare skin. Laura woke to the sound of branches knocking against the cabin and an odd pressure in the air that meant the storm was only stretching its shoulders before hitting full force. By noon, the forest had vanished behind a curtain of white. The clearing around the cabin dissolved into swirling ghosts, the tree line smudged beyond recognition. Laura stacked more wood by the stove, fed the fire, and checked her radio once more, though service had been spotty since the first flakes touched ground. By late afternoon, the storm had teeth, the kind that tore at the roof shingles and sent icy pellets rattling across the windows like handfuls of gravel. She paced the small living room, listening to the wind howl down from the ridge, her mind drifting to every creature out there with nothing but instinct and luck to shield them. The bobcat flickered across her thoughts, lean, cautious, carrying the weight of unseen little paws beside her. Laura imagined the mother cat pressed into some hollow, snow piling at the entrance, her breath clouding in tight, frightened bursts. She told herself not to care so much, but the thought stuck like a splinter. By nightfall, the cabin lights flickered, dimmed, then surrendered. The heater clicked off, and silence rushed in like a wave. Laura lit 2 lanterns and moved closer to the stove, wrapping herself in a blanket and listening to the storm rake across the mountains as if trying to peel the forest back to its bones. Sometime after midnight, a loud crack split the dark, a tree giving way under the weight of ice. The crash shook loose snow from the cabin roof, sending a heavy thump echoing overhead. Laura jerked upright, pulse racing the way it used to during emergency calls, except now she was the only responder for miles. She forced herself to breathe, slow and steady. She wasn't in an ambulance. She wasn't on black ice with sirens wailing. She was in a cabin built to withstand winters far worse than this. Still, her eyes drifted to the window, searching instinctively for movement, any sign that something out there needed help. But the world was a blank sheet. No paw prints, no shadows, no shapes slipping between trees. Even the wolves sounded distant tonight, their howls swallowed by the storm's fury. The emptiness felt heavier than fear, pressing at the back of her ribs until she hugged her arms to her chest. By the second day, snow lay knee-deep around the porch, and the woods remained eerily quiet. Laura boiled water, checked her emergency kit, then finally gave in to pacing again. A slow back and forth across the worn cabin floor. Outside, nothing moved. Not a bird, not a squirrel, not the bobcat she'd been trying not to think about. On the 3rd morning, the storm broke. The sky cleared as if someone had wiped it clean, leaving only sharp blue stretched over endless white. Laura shoveled a narrow path off the porch, each step crunching into dense snow as she made her way toward the tree line, her breath lifting in pale clouds. It didn't take long to find the tracks, deep impressions of the bobcat's paws pressed into the softened crust. But something was wrong. Instead of the steady, purposeful trail she'd grown used to, the prints veered left, then right, looping back on themselves, as if the cat had been searching desperately for something it couldn't find. She followed them farther, heart thudding, scanning the snow for the smaller footprints she'd seen once before. None appeared, only churned snow, scattered needles, and a single streak of red where the storm hadn't fully buried it. Laura crouched, fingers hovering above it, dread pooling cold in her stomach. She stood there a long time, staring at the disrupted trail as the wind lifted loose crystals into tiny shimmering swirls. The woods felt painfully silent, the kind of silence that follows after something has already been lost. Laura swallowed hard, forcing herself to step back toward the cabin even as her chest tightened. That night, sitting alone by the stove, she whispered the truth she had fought all afternoon to avoid. The small set of tracks was gone, erased, and whatever had followed the bobcat through the storm, wolves' cold hunger, had taken something precious from her. The mother cat was still out there, but her world had changed, and Laura felt that shift like a bruise blooming under her skin. The storm had passed, but its memory clung to the cabin like a chill that refused to leave. Laura woke before sunrise, the sky still the color of damp ash. She brewed coffee out of habit, though her stomach felt too tight to drink it, and stood by the window scanning the tree line with a quiet dread she tried not to name. For 2 days she had checked the clearing every morning, each time hoping for paw prints that never appeared. The bobcat's frantic, looping trail haunted her. Something had gone wrong out there in the whiteout, and the forest felt heavier for it, as if holding its breath. She wrapped both hands around the mug, willing the warmth to settle the restless ache behind her ribs. When the sound came, a soft scrape against the front door, she froze. It was the same measured rhythm she'd heard weeks earlier in the half-light of dawn. Scratch, pause, scratch. Her heart kicked once, then steadied in the way training had molded into her bones. Whatever waited outside would not go away by pretending she hadn't heard it. She set her mug down and moved through the cabin, steps slow, breath shallow. The deadbolt felt colder than the air itself as she touched it, bracing for whatever waited on the other side of the wood. 100 possibilities flashed through her mind, none of them gentle, and yet a strange, fragile hope threaded between them. At the window, her breath caught. The bobcat mother stood on her porch again, paws planted firmly, chest rising in ragged breaths. Frost clung to the fur along her spine, but her eyes, those amber, steady eyes, held none of the panic Laura expected. Instead, they carried something else entirely, a weary determination like a messenger returning from a long, punishing journey. Then she saw the bundle at the bobcat's feet. Small, motionless, a lump of fur matted with snow, curled tight as if trying to shrink from the cold. For a moment, Laura thought her heart had simply stopped, the world narrowing to nothing but that fragile shape lying half buried in winter's leftovers. She fumbled with the lock and eased the door open a crack. The cold slammed into her, sharp and metallic. The bobcat stiffened but didn't retreat. She took one step back, pushing the bundle forward with a gentle nudge of her paw. Laura sank to her knees, breath trembling as recognition slowly took shape in her mind. It wasn't the bobcat's missing kitten. It wasn't Wild at all. As Laura brushed away the snow, a small collar glinted beneath the frost, pink nylon, frayed at the edges, with a tiny silver bell that didn't make a sound. A house cat, a kitten, barely months old. And still breathing, though faint and uneven, as if every inhale was a decision it wasn't sure it could keep making. The bobcat watched every movement, muscles tense but controlled. This wasn't a kill. There was no blood on her paws, no torn fur. Instead, the little body bore the rough impressions of teeth not meant to crush, just carry. An animal moving something helpless the only way she knew how. Laura felt the truth settle in her chest. Heavy, improbable, undeniable. A coyote yipped somewhere beyond the ridge, sharp and distant. The bobcat's ears flicked toward the sound, then back to Laura, as if reminding her time was short. Laura slid her hands beneath the shivering bundle, warmth already leaving it too fast. The kitten's head lolled against her palm, a soft sound escaping its throat like a plea. She whispered, "I've got you," the words slipping out with a rawness she hadn't meant to show. Behind her, the bobcat took a slow step back. Not leaving, not threatening, simply watching with a vigilance that felt almost parental, though the tiny creature in Laura's arms shared nothing of her blood. For a moment, the three of them stood suspended in the cold morning. Human, predator, and the fragile life that had somehow bridged the distance between them. The wind stirred the bobcat's fur, ruffling the kitten's whiskers, and Laura felt an old tremor run through her hands, the kind that came when life hung on the thinnest thread, and she was the thread. Then the cold sharpened its bite, snapping her back to urgency. She rose, cradling the kitten against her coat. The bobcat lowered her head once, a silent motion filled with something Laura couldn't name, then stepped back into the shadows. As Laura closed the door behind her, one thought echoed through her chest with the force of a heartbeat. The bobcat had brought her a life to save. The heat inside the cabin vanished the moment Laura set the tiny kitten on the kitchen towel. Its fur clung to its skin in wet clumps, belly trembling with fast, shallow breaths. She grabbed the emergency kit she kept by the door, old paramedic habits never fully retired, and laid out gauze, warming packets, and the stethoscope she rarely used anymore. She whispered reassurances she wasn't sure either of them could hear over her pulse. The kitten's paws were stiff with cold, and its ears were pale at the edges. Early frostbite. As she rubbed the warming packet inside a folded cloth, she caught a faint jingle from the collar. Misty. The name hit her memory like a match striking in the dark. A week before the storm, a flyer had been posted outside the diner. A girl named Emily, no older than 10, holding a photo of this very kitten. Lost near town, last seen by the creek. The paper had been torn by the wind, but the child's determined smile had stayed with Laura. Now this fragile, fading bundle carried the same name etched on a tiny metal tag. She wrapped the kitten close to her, chest, zipped her coat, and grabbed her truck keys. Outside, the world was still half frozen, snow crunching sharp under boots. The forest held its breath behind her. The bobcat was gone, vanished into the trees the way only wild animals could. but Laura felt its presence lingering like a hand she couldn't quite see letting go. The engine groaned in protest before turning over. Laura cranked the heat, set the kitten in her lap wrapped in a towel, and backed out carefully, tires sliding until they found grip. The narrow mountain road was lined with drifts that hadn't fully settled, each bend hiding ice that glimmered under thin sunlight like glass laid across the earth. Halfway down the ridge, she met a familiar sheriff's SUV coming up the road. She flagged it down. Deputy Mark stepped out, breath fogging, concern flashing across his face the moment he saw her holding the bundle. "What happened?" he asked, scanning the woods behind her as if expecting trouble to emerge. "A bobcat brought her," Laura said, voice hoarse. "Set her right on my porch." Mark blinked at her, stunned into silence for a long moment, then exhaled with a low whistle. "That is not normal behavior." She didn't argue. There was no version of this story that sounded ordinary. But the kitten shivered again, and urgency pushed the questions aside. "Rachel's clinic," he said quickly. "She opened early for calving season. I'll radio ahead. Go slow. The bridge is slick." As he climbed back into his cruiser, he glanced at the tree line. "You sure the bobcat wasn't hunting it?" Laura shook her head. "No blood. No tear wounds. Just carried." The disbelief on his face almost mirrored her own. The drive into town felt longer than any emergency run she'd ever done in the city. The kitten's breathing rattled like thin paper in her hands. Each shallow rise a fragile argument against the cold that had seeped too far. She kept one hand on the wheel, the other cupped around the small heartbeat she hoped wouldn't fade. When she pulled into the gravel lot of Dr. Rachel Norris's veterinary clinic, the door swung open before she even reached it. Rachel, tall, red-haired, always moving like she had two places to be at once, gestured her inside. Mark radioed, "Bring her here." Her voice snapped with the focused calm of someone who had seen the worst and worked fast anyway. Laura laid the kitten on a heated pad while Rachel examined her with swift, practiced hands. Cold stress, dehydration, bruising along the ribs, teeth marks, but not predatory. She glanced up, eyebrows raised. Someone carried her, gently, like a mother cat would. She didn't need to say it for both of them to think it. As Rachel injected fluids and wrapped the tiny paws, Laura stood back, rubbing her arms against a chill that wasn't from the winter air. The scene played over in her mind. The bobcat standing in the snow, breathing hard, eyes steady, nudging this kitten toward her like passing responsibility between worlds that rarely touched. Rachel stepped away from the table, peeling off her gloves. "She's not out of danger," she said. "But she's fighting, and she's lucky whoever found her understood time mattered." Laura almost laughed at the understatement. Lucky wasn't the word she'd use. Chosen felt closer, though she wasn't sure she deserved that kind of trust. As the clinic grew quiet, Laura rested a hand lightly above the kitten's tiny form, feeling the warmth slowly returning. Outside, snow fell again, in a gentler hush, covering the last traces of the storm. Somewhere beyond town, in the dark lines of the forest, a bobcat mother moved through the trees with empty steps, and Laura felt the echo of that loss deep in her own bones. For the next 2 days, Laura stayed close to the clinic, sleeping on a narrow cot in the break room while Misty fought her way back from the edge of cold and shock. The kitten's breaths grew steadier, her paws warming from bluish-gray to soft pink. Every small improvement landed in Laura's chest like a fragile victory she wasn't sure she deserved. Rachel stopped by every few hours, bringing charts and warm tea, her voice low as she explained each slow step. "She's responding better than I expected," she said one morning, leaning over the tiny form. "Some animals have a stubborn streak that beats the odds." Laura smiled faintly. "She picked it up from whoever brought her." Still, the more Misty improved, the heavier Laura felt inside. Every time she touched the kitten's fur, she saw the bobcat's amber eyes, steady, pleading, and impossibly calm. A wild mother giving up something she had carried through a storm. A creature who didn't speak her language but had somehow trusted her anyway. On the afternoon of the third day, the clinic door opened with a soft jingle, and Mark stepped in, shaking snow from his jacket. He looked tired, like he'd been patrolling farther than usual. When his gaze found Laura sitting by the heated pad, something softer crossed his expression. "How's our little fighter?" he asked quietly. "She's stable," Laura said, brushing a fingertip across Misty's back. "Eating on her own now. Stronger every hour." Mark leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "That's good. Folks in town will be relieved. Emily especially." At the mention of the girl's name, guilt pricked behind Laura's ribs. Sharp, Unavoidable. Mark hesitated, then lowered his voice. I drove the Ridge Road yesterday. Found tracks near your property. Bobcat prints, big ones. She circled the clearing twice. Laura's breath caught, a familiar ache blooming beneath her sternum. Was she searching? Mark shrugged gently. Looks that way. Hard to say, but she came back. The thought settled over her in a quiet, emotional weight. The Bobcat had survived the storm, and she had returned to the place she'd carried the kitten from, as if checking that the choice she'd made hadn't been in vain. Laura pressed a hand to her forehead, the room tilting slightly with the mix of relief and something deeper. Rachel poked her head in, cutting through the moment with her usual practical tone. Misty's ready to be released to her owner tomorrow. I called the family. They're driving in first thing. Laura nodded, forcing herself not to look down at the kitten as if she might lose something she hadn't admitted to wanting. That night, back at her cabin, the world felt strangely hollow. The storm drifts were smaller now, and moonlight spilled across the clearing like a thin silver wash. Laura stepped onto the porch, breath fogging in the cold, scanning the tree line the way she had each evening since the storm ended. The silence pressed in around her, patient and wide. A soft crunch echoed from the shadows. She stiffened, gripping the porch rail. Another step, light, deliberate. Then the shape emerged from the trees, faint and low. The Bobcat moved slowly, her gait steady but tired, her coat dull where it had been sleek before the storm. She stopped at the edge of the clearing, head lifting toward the porch. Laura didn't move, didn't speak. The distance between them felt like a fragile thing, an old wound and a new bond tied together in one winter thread. The Bobcat blinked once, long and slow, the way animals do when they mean no threat and no fear. Then she stepped back, fading into the forest with the ease of smoke slipping into air. Laura exhaled shakily, the breath she'd been holding warming her numb lips. The Bobcat wasn't gone, not fully, but she had returned to a life that didn't need Laura in it. And tomorrow Misty would go home to the girl who had cried for her in a torn flyer. Life, it seemed, was stitching itself back together in ways both gentle and cruel. Inside, Laura closed the door softly, leaning her forehead against the wood. She felt gratitude. She felt loss. And somewhere in the quiet center of her chest, she felt the echo of a trust she hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. The Bobcat had come back once, and the forest didn't give gifts without reason. Morning light crept gently over the valley as Laura pulled into the clinic parking lot, feeling the quiet weight of the day. Misty would be going home, back to the little girl who had waded through the storm with hope bigger than the mountains themselves. Laura tried to smile at the thought, but her chest felt strangely hollow, like she was leaving something unfinished. Inside, Emily and her parents were already there, the girl clutching a soft blanket in both hands. The second she saw Misty, her breath caught, and she pressed the kitten to her cheek with a choked little laugh. "Thank you," Emily whispered to Laura, voice trembling. "Thank you for finding her." Laura managed a nod, though the truth of who had truly found. Misty pulled at her like a tide. When the family left, Rachel leaned against the counter, arms folded lightly. "You did good, Laura. Not just the rescue, the staying, the caring." Laura looked at her hands, feeling a quiet ache ripple through her. "I didn't save Misty," she murmured. "I just listened when something wild asked me to help." Rachel didn't argue. She simply placed a warm hand on Laura's shoulder before stepping away. The drive home felt longer than usual, the road winding through pines that glittered under the thin winter sun. When she reached the cabin, she parked and remained in the truck for a moment, breathing in the silence. The forest looked untouched, a white sheet stretched across an ancient wound. But she knew better. Every inch held stories she had barely begun to understand. Inside, she set her gloves on the table and moved toward the porch window, out of habit. The clearing was empty. No tracks, no movement, no sign that a bobcat had ever stood there with frost on her whiskers and impossible trust in her eyes. The emptiness pressed at her, a soft ache wrapped in gratitude. As evening settled, she stepped outside with a mug of tea, letting the cold nip at her cheeks. A soft wind drifted through the pines, carrying the faint scent of thawing earth. She closed her eyes, imagining the bobcat somewhere deep in the forest, carrying her own silence and sorrow through the underbrush where no human footsteps could follow. Then, faint, almost imagined, a sound brushed the edge of the quiet. Not a branch shifting, not snow falling from a limb. A deliberate scrape like claws on wood. Laura's eyes snapped open, heart thudding with a mix of disbelief and something brighter. The sound came again, steady and patient, at the front door. She moved slowly, breath caught somewhere between hope and fear. When she reached the window, her pulse surged. The bobcat mother stood on the porch again, posture calm, tail low. Her coat looked fuller now, healthier, the wildness in her eyes softened by something Laura couldn't name. Snow dusted her back like scattered stars. At the cat's feet lay another small shape, this one curled, alive, blinking weakly in the cold. A kit. Younger than the first. Its fur was mottled and soft, its eyes opening and closing in slow, uncertain blinks. Not injured, just exhausted, just carried far. The bobcat nudged the kit gently toward the door, then stepped back, muscles relaxed but ready. Laura felt her throat tighten. This wasn't a plea born of desperation like before. This was something else, something quieter, deeper. A gesture from a wild creature offering the closest thing her world had to thanks. Or perhaps a bridge, one built not from fear or loss, but from recognition that two lives had crossed in a storm and survived. Slowly, Laura opened the door, letting the warm cabin air spill onto the porch. The kit let out a soft chirrup, lifting its head. The mother, Bobcat, did not move, watching with a steady, unblinking calm. Laura crouched, letting the kit crawl onto her glove before lifting it gently into her arms, her breath trembling with the fragile wonder of it all. For a moment, human and wild stood close enough to share the same winter air. The bobcat dipped her head once, slow, deliberate, then turned and walked back into the forest with the grace of something carved from the land itself. She didn't disappear quickly this time. She paused at the tree line, looked back once, then slipped between the pines without a sound. Inside, Laura settled the new kit by the stove's warmth, feeling a fullness gather in her chest, something like healing, something like beginning. She understood then. The bobcat had not come to reopen an old wound. She had come to offer closure, to acknowledge a bond that winter had carved into both of them. And as the snow fell softly outside, Laura whispered to the quiet cabin, "You're safe now. She brought you here because she trusted me." The words eased something deep inside her, a wound she hadn't known she was still carrying. For the first time in a long while, the forest felt less like a place she had fled to and more like a place that had chosen her back. If you've made it all the way to the end of this story, I'd love to hear from you. Just drop a simple 0 or 1 in the comments to let me know you're here. Your small comment actually helps this channel reach more people who enjoy quiet, meaningful stories like this one. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and turn on the bell. There are many more true-to-life, heartwarming wilderness tales coming your way. Thank you for spending your time with me today. I hope to see you again in the next story.
If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear from you. Just drop a simple 0 or a 1 in the comments so I know you were here and felt something tonight.